Before 7,000 years ago, humans were doing something that shouldn't have been possible. They were opening skulls, and people were surviving. No metal tools, no hospitals, no anesthesia, just stone, bone, and a success rate modern doctors still struggle to explain. So how did ancient humans perform something that looks like neurosurgery long before medicine existed? When archaeologists first began uncovering ancient burial sites, they expected pottery, tools, bones. But what they found instead was something far more unsettling: skulls with deliberate, perfect openings carved into them, and clear signs that the people had lived long after the bone was cut. The oldest confirmed trepanations lead us across continents like a breadcrumb trail of forgotten medical knowledge. In Peru, the evidence is overwhelming. More than 800 skulls, the largest collection on Earth, each bearing precise circular or oval openings. Some show smooth, healed edges, meaning the patients didn't just survive, they lived months, years, even decades after the skull was opened. The Inca and the cultures before them weren't experimenting. They had a system, a technique, a tradition. Travel thousands of miles to France, to sites dating back 6,500 years, where early farmers and warriors carried the same scars, round, intentional holes cut into bone that had grown back, proving survival. In Ukraine, even Neanderthals, humans who lived before history began, left behind skulls with carefully shaved openings. Not random damage, not ritual mutilation, but something methodical, controlled, purposeful. Move west to Spain, down into Libya, across Kenya, and into the mountains of Nepal. Everywhere the same unmistakable pattern appears: a hole carved into the skull, shaped by human hands, surrounded by bone that tried to heal. In China, ancient burial sites revealed trepanations done with astonishing symmetry. In Australia, Aboriginal remains show openings that were clearly made with stone blades and incredible precision. The shocking part is not just the widespread presence of these skulls, but the fact that they appear in places that had no contact with one another. Different languages, different tools, different myths, yet all practicing the same impossible surgery. This global footprint tells us one thing: trepanation wasn't a regional trick or a cultural accident. It was a universal human discovery, a shared intuition across civilizations separated by oceans and millennia. Ancient people, without science or anatomy or written knowledge, somehow reached the same conclusion: to save a life, sometimes you had to open the skull. As archaeologists studied skull after skull, one question rose above all others: why? Why would ancient humans, people with no hospitals, no anesthesia, no scientific framework, choose to open the skull, the most dangerous place on the human body? The answers, scattered across continents and eras, paint a picture of humanity wrestling with injury, mystery, and the invisible world they believed shaped their lives. First, there was war, brutal, intimate, hand-to-hand war. The Stone Age was not a peaceful era. It was an age of stone axes, wooden clubs, and spearheads that shattered bone. When a blow to the head caused swelling or bleeding inside the skull, death often followed. But some ancient healers discovered a desperate solution: remove part of the skull to relieve the pressure, and the warrior might survive. This wasn't theory. Trauma around trepanation sites proves many of these openings were life-saving emergency surgeries. Second, trepanation emerged as a response to the mysteries of the mind. Epilepsy, uncontrollable anger, violent seizures, deep depression, conditions we now understand medically, were interpreted by early societies as spiritual invasions. To them, the person wasn't sick. something was trapped inside their head. A hole in the skull became a symbolic doorway, a way to release a spirit, a curse, a shadow gripping the mind. Third, in some cases, it was the only treatment people knew for overwhelming headaches. Ancient records and healed skulls show trepanation used for what today we'd call migraines. Headaches so intense that drilling a hole in the skull felt like relief rather than torture. And for many, it actually worked. Fourth, the practice carried deep spiritual and ritual meaning. Trepanation wasn't always medicine. Sometimes it was a ceremony. Some skulls bear 2 or even 3 openings, not from repeated injury, but repeated rites. To shamans and healers, opening the skull allowed visions to enter, malevolent forces to escape, or protective spirits to dwell within. A ritual doorway carved into bone. Fifth, the procedure was a practical solution to battlefield injuries. If a shard of stone or a fragment of a club lodged itself in the skull, ancient surgeons would cut into the bone to remove it, not out of belief, but necessity. Many skulls with clean healing marks show that this emergency intervention saved lives more often than it ended them. And sixth, some trepanations were not performed on the living at all. Archaeologists found skulls opened after death, deliberate, careful cuts made during funeral rites. The goal? To free the spirit, protect the body, or prepare the deceased for the journey into another world. In some cultures, pieces of the removed bone were turned into amulets, worn as symbols of protection or reverence. Across all these explanations, one truth becomes clear. Trepanation wasn't madness, it was humanity's attempt to understand suffering, heal the wounded, and navigate the unknown. A crude, dangerous act, but also one of the earliest signs of medical intuition in our species. What makes trepanation truly astonishing isn't just the act itself, it's the tools. Not metal scalpels, not bronze instruments, not anything we would recognize as surgical. Ancient surgeons worked with the raw materials of the earth, yet somehow produced results that feel impossible even today. They began with flint, a stone that fractures into razor-thin blades, with edges so fine they could glide through skin almost effortlessly. Flint wasn't just sharp, it was predictable. Each strike revealed a new cutting surface, allowing the healer to renew their blade within seconds. But the true miracle was obsidian, the volcanic glass created in eruptions and cooled into shimmering black stone. When chipped correctly, obsidian forms an edge so unbelievably thin, measured on the molecular scale, that modern studies show it is 30 times sharper than the stainless steel scalpels used in hospitals today. Under a microscope, a steel blade looks jagged, serrated, full of tiny imperfections. Obsidian, by contrast, is almost perfectly smooth. It slices tissue instead of tearing it, creating cleaner wounds, less bleeding, and lower infection, all benefits ancient surgeons could not explain scientifically, yet clearly recognized through experience. They complemented these blades with polished bone tools, carved and shaped into narrow scrapers and delicate levers. Bone might sound primitive, but in skilled hands it became an instrument of remarkable control, able to manipulate the skull without shattering it. And when the incision was made and the bone began to open, the surgeon turned to smooth river stones. These were used to grind, refine, and finish the cut, slowly erasing the jagged edges until the whole looked intentional, almost elegant. Some skulls show such precision that the edges resemble the work of a craftsman, not a Stone Age healer working by firelight. Imagine the scene: a dark hut or a mountain cave, a wounded warrior or a trembling patient lying still. The healer kneeling beside them, choosing between pieces of obsidian glinting like black mirrors, flint shards arranged in careful rows, bone tools smoothed from years of use. nothing sterile, nothing metallic, and yet an operation begins that modern neurosurgeons study with disbelief. The tools were simple, but in the hands of these early surgeons, they became something extraordinary. This wasn't crude trial and error. This was a craft, refined, intentional, built on generations who had learned exactly which stone to break, which blade to lift, and how much pressure the skull could endure before the line between life and death was crossed. And somehow, against every expectation, people survived. To understand why so many ancient trepanation patients survived, you have to look closely, microscopically, at the material in the surgeon's hand. Not bronze, not iron, but obsidian, a volcanic glass so sharp, so pure, that even modern surgeons struggle to match its precision. When obsidian fractures, it doesn't break like stone. It shatters like perfection. The edges form on a molecular scale, creating a blade so thin that its cutting surface can be only a few nanometers across. In laboratory tests, when scientists compared obsidian blades to the finest European surgical steel, the results were almost unbelievable. Obsidian was up to 30 times sharper. Under a microscope, a steel scalpel looks rough. Tiny serrations, microscopic teeth, ridges that tear more than they cut. But obsidian? Its edge appears almost like a line of black light, smooth, continuous, flawless. It slices cleanly through tissue with minimal trauma, leaving wounds that are narrower, gentler, and far less prone to infection. This wasn't something ancient people understood through theory. They learned it the hard way, by watching who lived and who didn't. A healer who used a dull stone saw more bleeding, more swelling, more death. A healer who used obsidian saw patients stand up days later, the wound crisp and clean, healing with astonishing speed for a Stone Age operation. And this matters for one simple reason: infection was the real killer. Long before antibiotics, the slightest contamination meant disaster. But obsidian blades, because of their purity and their unbelievably smooth edge, carried fewer microbes, caused less tearing, and opened the skull with a grace metal blades couldn't match until thousands of years later. So when we look at healed trepanation skulls in Peru, France, Nepal, or Africa, and wonder how so many people survived such a brutal operation, the answer often lies in that shimmering black shard, a blade crafted not by metallurgy, but by volcanic fire, and sharper than anything Europe would produce until the modern age. Obsidian wasn't primitive, it was perfect. And its perfection is one of the hidden reasons trepanation wasn't just attempted, it was mastered. If there is one part of trepanation that stops modern viewers cold, it's the pain. We imagine ancient surgery and hope, somehow, that they had a way to escape it. But the truth is harsher. Most trepanations were performed while the patient was fully conscious. No modern anesthesia, no numbing injections, just a terrified human being lying beneath a healer who was about to cut into the skull itself. And yet, ancient people weren't helpless. Across continents, they developed crude but clever ways to dull the agony, just enough to survive the procedure. In the highlands of Peru, patients chewed leaves of the coca plant, allowing the alkaloids to numb the mouth, the face, and eventually the scalp. Not full anesthesia, just a drifting softness that made the blade slightly more bearable. Elsewhere, healers burned or brewed opium, coaxing its smoke or tinctures into the patient's bloodstream. Some used cannabis, not to knock the person unconscious, but to pull them into a trance where time fractured and pain became distant. Other methods were far more brutal. Some surgeons struck the patient at the base of the skull, trying to induce brief unconsciousness, an ancient attempt at a knockout blow. Others pressed hard on the carotid arteries, restricting blood flow long enough to dim awareness. In some tribes, a rhythmic chant or ritual drumming created a hypnotic state, dulling fear and magnifying surrender. And then there was the strangest phenomenon of all. When the skull is opened, when bone is scraped or drilled, and the pressure inside the head begins to change, the brain itself can enter a state of bewildering clarity. Some anthropologists describe it as a shock-born trance, where the mind detaches from the pain, not because of medicine, but because the body simply cannot process what is happening. Still, make no mistake, even with herbs, trance, or brief unconsciousness, trepanation hurt, a kind of pain beyond anything most humans will ever know. Scraping the skull for an hour or more, drilling hole after hole while awake, feeling the vibration of stone against bone, hearing the sound from inside your own head. The fact that patients stayed still at all is a miracle. The fact that many survived is something even greater. Trepanation wasn't just a medical act. It was a test of endurance, of faith, of desperation, of the human body's terrifying capacity to cling to life through sheer force of will. For archaeologists, the most astonishing part of trepanation isn't the hole in the skull, it's the story the bone tells afterward. Because bone is alive, it reacts, it heals, and if a person survived the surgery, the skull records that survival with the precision of a diary carved in calcium. When scientists examine an ancient trepanation skull, the first thing they look for is the edge. A fresh, fatal cut leaves the bone sharp, brittle, almost shattered. But a survivor's skull, its edges turn smooth, softened by time as new bone slowly crawls across the wound. Under magnification, the rim looks rounded, polished from within, a sure sign that life continued after the blade withdrew. Next, they search for the outer table of the bone, the hard protective layer that the body rebuilds only when healing is underway. If this layer reforms, sometimes curling inward like a thin white shelf, it means the patient lived long enough for their skull to begin knitting itself back together. Sometimes the bone even begins to thicken around the opening, a ring of new growth that acts like a frame around the site of surgery. This is one of the clearest signatures of survival, the body reinforcing itself after a trauma that should have been fatal. Archaeologists also check for fracture patterns. If the skull shows no radiating cracks, no splintering, no chaotic lines of trauma, it suggests the surgeon worked with astonishing control and that the patient didn't die from sudden pressure or internal breakage. And perhaps the most revealing evidence of all is the symmetry of healing. Years after trepanation, the bone begins to match the thickness of the surrounding skull. When that uniformity appears, it means the person didn't just survive, they lived long enough for their skull to fully remodel. Some skulls show healing that lasted months, others years. And then there are the extraordinary cases, skulls with trepanation scars so old and so well healed that the individual may have lived decades after the operation. But the rarest, most jaw-dropping discoveries of all are the skulls with multiple trepanations, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 separate surgeries, each performed at different times, each showing clear signs of survival. To endure trepanation once is incredible. To survive it repeatedly suggests something else entirely. A culture that trusted the procedure and patience whose resilience defies modern imagination.
These skulls aren't just artifacts, they are testimonies, silent proof that ancient surgeons, armed with nothing but stone and instinct, saved lives in ways we are only now beginning to understand.
When researchers began comparing trepanation across different civilizations, they expected the numbers to show a clear pattern. The farther back in history you go, the worse the success rates must be. But the data told a completely different story, one that overturned assumptions and humbled modern medicine. Nowhere on Earth were the results more astonishing than in ancient Peru. There, highland surgeons working with obsidian blades and herbal antiseptics achieved survival rates that seem almost impossible for a Stone Age procedure. Of the hundreds of skulls analyzed, 70 to 80% showed clear signs of healing. Some were so cleanly executed, so elegantly scraped, that even today's neurosurgeons marvel at the technical mastery involved. In the mountains of Nepal and Tibet, the technique was nearly as refined. Here, survival rates hovered around 50 to 60%, still extraordinary given the limited tools, the harsh climate, and the absence of anything resembling modern medicine. These weren't isolated miracles. They were part of a tradition, repeated over generations, passed from healer to apprentice in a lineage of skill that left its signature on bone. Travel back farther into Stone Age Europe, and the numbers dip but remain surprisingly strong. Skulls from Neolithic France, Spain, and Germany show healing in 30 to 45% of cases, meaning early farmers and hunters were performing brain-adjacent surgery with success rates many medieval physicians could only dream of. And then comes the twist, the detail historians still struggle to explain. By the Middle Ages, when Europe had metal tools, written medical texts, and organized guilds of surgeons, the survival rate of cranial surgery dropped to below 20%. More than half a millennium of technological progress, yet the outcomes were worse, sometimes dramatically worse, than those achieved by ancient civilizations using stone knives. The conclusion is as unsettling as it is fascinating. In many parts of the world, ancient surgeons were outperforming European doctors of the 1600s. They understood pressure relief. They understood careful, gradual bone removal. They understood infection in a practical sense, long before the word bacteria existed. Trepanation wasn't a desperate ritual. It was a craft so refined that in some eras it surpasses the medical success of supposedly advanced societies. And buried in the numbers is a humbling truth. Progress isn't always a straight line, and sometimes the ancients knew more than we give them credit for. For all its surprising success, trepanation was still a gamble with death. Every hole carved into a skull was a tightrope walk between brilliance and catastrophe, and ancient surgeons knew it. The risks were everywhere, woven into every scrape of stone against bone. The most immediate danger was penetrating too deep. Beneath the skull lies the dura mater, a thin, delicate membrane protecting the brain. If the surgeon slipped or pushed with a fraction too much force, the stone blade could pierce the brain tissue itself. A single wrong movement meant instant seizures, paralysis, or death. Some skulls show these fatal mistakes, jagged holes that extend inward, frozen evidence of a moment when the healer crossed the line between surgery and tragedy. Then there was infection, the invisible killer no ancient culture could name. Even with clean obsidian and herbal antiseptics, bacteria were everywhere, on hands, in soil, in the air, in the wound. A tiny infection could spread into the bone, causing osteomyelitis, fever, swelling, and a slow, agonizing decline. In skulls that show no healing at all, infection is often the silent reason. Uncontrolled bleeding posed another threat. The skull itself doesn't bleed much, but the tissue underneath does.
A nicked artery or a torn vein could flood the surgical area within seconds. Without cauterization or clamps, the healer had only their hands, pressure, and hope, and sometimes that wasn't enough. And of course, there was pain, raw, overwhelming pain. The shock alone could kill a patient. Heart rate spiked, breathing fractured. Some people simply slipped into unconsciousness and never returned. Even the strongest herb mixtures couldn't erase the reality that someone was scraping or drilling into living bone. Primitive tools added their own dangers. A flint blade that dulled mid-surgery could tear instead of cut. A bone scraper could splinter. A misaligned drill could crack the skull like pottery, sending fractures racing outward. And even after a successful operation, aftercare was a fragile hope. A bandage too tight, a wound left open, a stray grain of sand, a night slept on dirty ground, any of these could undo the surgeon's hard work and lead to deadly infection days later. Yet, despite all this, despite stone tools, no anesthesia, no antiseptics, no understanding of microbes, no hospitals, the survival rates were astonishing. Half, 2/3, sometimes even more. And that is perhaps the greatest mystery of all, that in an age without science, without textbooks, without sterile instruments, human beings still found a way to open the skull and walk away alive. For archaeologists, trepanation is not just a medical mystery, it is a window into the strangest corners of ancient belief and survival. Because the deeper they dig, the more they realize humanity didn't just open skulls, it experimented with them. Some skulls show 2, even 3 perfectly aligned openings, proof that the same person underwent trepanation multiple times, surviving each attempt long enough for the bone to heal before the next. These weren't desperate surgeries, they were rituals repeated again and again, as if the opening in the skull was believed to reset the mind or release something trapped within. Then there are skulls missing circular pieces, and those missing pieces show up elsewhere, polished smooth, turned into charms worn around the neck. Imagine it, someone carrying a pendant made from the bone of the living, a fragment of a friend, a healer, a warrior. To some cultures, that piece held power. To others, protection. To others still, it was a doorway between worlds. Even more haunting is the case of a 1-year-old child whose tiny skull bears a trepanation hole. The opening is small, precise, and shows signs of healing. Someone, perhaps a desperate parent, believed that cutting into the infant's skull could save its life. And not all holes were made for the living. Some skulls were trepanned after death, their edges sharp and unhealed. These weren't surgeries, they were rituals, attempts to free the spirit, guide the dead, or prevent their return. In other cases, archaeologists found skulls with their openings carefully sealed, using a resin-like substance, an early form of medical dressing. The mixture hardened over the bone, almost like a primitive surgical patch. Some ingredients were antibacterial, others were symbolic. Together, they reveal minds trying to blend medicine with magic. And in the most astonishing finds, some ancient cultures even sealed cranial openings with thin sheets of beaten gold, not for wealth, but for healing, for purity, for the belief that a metal incorruptible by time could stabilize a body fighting death. Piece by piece, these discoveries show that trepanation wasn't one practice, it was a spectrum of medicine, ritual, fear, hope, and imagination. A rare moment where the human skull became the stage on which science and superstition met face to face.
In the grand story of medicine, trepanation marks a turning point, a moment when early humans first realized that the skull was not an untouchable barrier, but a door. A dangerous door, yes, but one that could mean the difference between life and death. Long before hospitals, anesthesia, or even written language, someone looked at a wounded man lying on the ground, breathing shallowly, pupils widening, life slipping away, and understood something profound. Pressure kills. Releasing it saves. That single realization is the seed from which all modern neurosurgery would eventually grow. Trepanation is the earliest evidence that humans recognized the brain as a delicate organ trapped inside a rigid shell, and that sometimes the shell itself becomes the threat. It represents the birth of a radical new idea. Not every blow to the head is a death sentence. If the skull swells, open it. If blood pools beneath the bone, relieve it. If consciousness fades, intervene before the darkness closes in. From this simple but revolutionary logic came the first steps toward primitive neurosurgery. Ancient healers learned to distinguish between injuries that needed intervention and those that didn't, effectively creating the earliest form of triage for cranial trauma. And their tools reflected that growing understanding. The crude stones of the earliest attempts gradually evolved into finer scrapers, smoother blades, more precise edges. Every improvement in toolmaking pushed them closer to what we now recognize as surgical technique: deliberate, controlled, purposeful. Trepanation also marks the origins of surgical classification. As archaeologists study the skulls, they see that different openings show different intentions, some wide and shallow to relieve bleeding, some narrow and deep to remove foreign fragments, some carefully shaped to perform repeated ritual or medical procedures. In other words, the earliest surgeons were already dividing cranial operations into types long before medicine had terms for them. Modern neurosurgeons look at these ancient skulls and recognize, almost with disbelief, the logic behind them. Craniotomy, decompression, hematoma evacuation. These procedures didn't begin in bright operating rooms. They began on dirt floors, by firelight, with stone tools, guided by courage, instinct, and a desperate will to save a life. Trepanation is not just the oldest surgical technique. It is the first time in history humanity fought back against death using knowledge instead of chance. Today, in the bright, silent sterility of a modern operating room, neurosurgeons perform procedures that look incredibly sophisticated. Burr holes drilled with precision tools, full craniotomies guided by imaging screens, decompression surgeries designed to relieve dangerous swelling inside the skull. But beneath all the advanced equipment, beneath the sterile gloves and the titanium instruments, the heart of the operation is identical to what ancient healers discovered thousands of years ago. When pressure builds inside the skull, you must open a door. Every modern cranial surgery is an echo of that Stone Age intuition. When a patient arrives with a subdural hematoma, blood pooling between brain and bone, the surgeon drills a small burr hole, the modern descendant of the trepanation opening, to release the fluid and save the brain from suffocation. When swelling threatens to crush neural tissue after trauma, the surgeon performs a decompression, removing a piece of the skull to allow the brain to expand safely. It is the same principle ancient doctors practiced while kneeling beside a wounded warrior. Relieve the pressure, and the life might return. When a tumor grows, when fluid accumulates, when a fracture presses inward, modern neurosurgeons intervene by lifting or reshaping the skull, a sophisticated version of the same life-saving instinct that drove prehistoric surgeons to scrape away bone with obsidian blades. The tools have changed. The light is brighter. The room is cleaner. The science is deeper.
But the idea remains untouched across 7 millennia. The skull is not inviolable. It can be opened, repaired, reshaped, and the person inside can live. What began as a desperate maneuver performed by firelight with stone and bone has become one of the most advanced fields in modern medicine, and yet, at its core, every neurosurgeon still follows the same ancient logic whispered through centuries of bone and blood. If the brain is in danger, you make space for it to survive.
Before you assume trepanation belongs entirely to the distant past, buried with stone tools and forgotten rituals, you discover something unsettling. It never truly disappeared. In a few corners of the modern world, the practice survives, whispered through tradition and necessity. In remote villages of Nepal, healers still open the skull to relieve pressure of spirits using blades passed down through generations. In parts of East Africa, certain tribes perform small cranial openings as part of ceremonies meant to drive out illness or restore balance to the mind. These aren't reenactments or staged rituals. They are living traditions, carried out by people who believe the boundary between the physical and the spiritual lies just beneath a thin layer of bone. And then comes the strangest chapter of all, one that doesn't belong to ancient history or isolated cultures, but to the 20th century itself, the self-trepanation movement. In the 1960s and 70s, a small group of experimental thinkers in Europe and the United States became convinced that drilling a hole in one's own skull would increase cerebral blood flow, expand consciousness, or restore the openness of childhood. Some performed the operation on themselves, using hand drills, mirrors, and terrifying determination. Their writings describe the moment the drill breaks through, a burst of pressure, a warm rush, a sense of lightness. Medical science, of course, dismissed these attempts as dangerous pseudoscience, but the movement gained enough notoriety that documentaries, interviews, and even guides appeared, each more unsettling than the last. It's a bizarre reminder that trepanation is not just an artifact in museums. It is a human instinct that resurfaces again and again, whether driven by belief, desperation, pain, or curiosity. Thousands of years after the first skulls were opened with obsidian and flint, the idea still pulls people toward the edge of the unknown, challenging the thin frontier between the brain and the world outside.